In First Kings, we heard about how Solomon built the house of God. Now, in this chapter, we read about how he is building his own house. But in addition to his own house, Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. Not only are we beginning to hear about Solomon's marriage to women who are not of the same faith, to non Jews or Gentiles, but in this case, it's the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, remember, the Jews were held as slaves in Egypt and delivered and freed by God through Moses, the great prophet and leader. That's the great foundational story of the Jewish people, how God, through Moses, led them out of Egypt, which represents a land of slavery and a land of suffocation almost, which is why the Holy Family goes into Egypt, fleeing from Herod, and then comes back to fulfill the prophecy that the people of God are called out of Egypt, as is the Messiah himself. So here we begin to hear about some of Solomon's flaws. He's married Pharaoh's daughter, which is, of all Gentile women to marry, one of the most problematic. Also, we have in some of these other readings, we have Psalm 13, which is a great psalm about suffering and yet hoping in God. Some of these psalms are very good to pray if you're going through difficult times. Baruch, in particular, now is talking about, he's going into detail about how and why the Jews are suffering in exile. But let's look here at Acts, and I'm just going to say a little bit about this because this is often quoted by people. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all, that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. It's a form of communism, you might say. This is often used by socialists and communists as a kind of scriptural warrant for what they do, although the Catholic Church teaches that personal property is among the rights of human beings. But that isn't clear from this passage. But this passage is part A. Part B comes tomorrow when we read about a couple who does just this. They sell something and lay the proceeds at the apostles' feet, or do they? We hear more about how private property fits into this scheme tomorrow. But this is an ideal situation. You know, you can tell from Paul's epistles, which we're not studying this semester, they were all written to early churches that were having trouble and arguing with one another and not believing what they had been taught. So even the early church was not perfect, although this is a picture of a kind of perfection, a community that truly supports one another. Because if you're willing to support one another financially, which requires a sacrifice, then you would be willing to support one another emotionally, spiritually, and so forth. I'm shocked at the fact that there really is no Christian community in any of our parishes, from what I can tell, after 22 years of having been a Catholic, and even organizations that I thought were composed of Catholics who supported one another and who were true Christians in community, I have since learned, are not that at all. We lack this kind of koinonia, which is one-mindedness, sense of communion. This is what we no longer have, I think. Though apparently, at least early on, it existed in a limited way. But it didn't, because we're going to see tomorrow in Acts, the first verses of Acts chapter 5, how it really didn't work. Greed didn't vanish from among the Christians of the early church. So keep that in mind. Also, of course, today we hear one of the few miracles, if not the only one, that appears in all four Gospels. The changing of the multiplication of loaves and the multiplication of fish. This begins John chapter 6, which is, of course, the great chapter about the bread of life and the Eucharist, which we'll get into in the next few days. So there's more to look forward to. And if you're having a bad day, pray Psalm 13. More tomorrow, part 2, or part B of what we're starting today.